Stephen Stoll, welcome to the Inquiring Mind podcast.
Thank you.
Okay, so before we get started, can you tell the audience a little bit about yourself, what you do, and why you wrote your most recent book, Ram Hollow?
No. I'm an environmental historian. I teach at Fordham University. I grew up in Southern California and would drive through the Central Valley where there were farms because I was from this postmodern, completely cemented world in which there was no wild nature poking itself up except a couple of possums and mourning doves. And when I went into the Central Valley, I didn't understand that I was also seeing a completely machine-made place with industrial labor, but I didn't understand it. I understood that's where food came, where cotton came from, where rice came from, and oranges, but I didn't understand it. So I guess the simple answer is that it kind of put the hook in me, and I just wanted to make sense of this weird alchemy in which the earth grows food. It's really all about my alienation from the natural world that in fact spawned me to learn more about it. And so that followed me through graduate school, and I started writing about agriculture. With Appalachia, I guess it's really a book about capitalism masquerading as a book about the Southern Mountains, but I really wanted to understand the Southern Mountains. They were also a complete mystery to me, completely outside of my experience. People say, well, you have some connection to it personally. I do not, zero. So I was a visitor, and that turned out to be an effective way to visit, to go there and to meet people, because you can say, well, inform me because I don't understand how this place works. So it was a combination of the fact that I'm an environmental historian, and I developed a real interest in trying to understand capitalism, how it works, why we have this as a social system. And the book is an exploration, I guess, of all these things.
Okay, and how did you first kind of get to Appalachia? How was that process? How did you go, you know what, this is what I want to write my next book about?
I think it probably started with one of the almost innumerable essays and books about the Whiskey Rebellion and Alexander Hamilton, and it just wasn't satisfying to me. I thought, wait a minute, where is this happening? No one ever pays attention to where it's happening. And sure enough, it's in these southern counties of Pennsylvania, and that's just right over the border of what was Virginia, and subsequently 1863 West Virginia. That it's really, it takes place in Appalachia, and those stories are just not linked together. But like, really, how did I get there? The first time I went there, that kind of thing? Well, I just flew to Pittsburgh and rented a car and explored those counties. And I was on my way to West Virginia University to do research, and stopped off, found some log cabins, and just kind of looked around and met someone who was a good guide who I ended up writing about, and he showed me around. And I decided that an interest in this and what might have been an article, I thought, I'm going to write a book about this because I want to understand it. It is no big story. It's no big drama, really. I drove all around it. I found it unbelievably perplexing. I say in the book, there's no straight lines, and there's just no straight lines.
What did you find about the region in particular? Was it that was most interesting to you? Was it the people, the land? What was so perplexing, as you say?
I think what's perplexing about it is that these are people who live in mountains and they have a certain mountain economy, but a whole series of association stories, lore, even racial notions are projected onto them. So I found that it was intellectualized. And if you think I'm doing that, this is what everybody does to Appalachia, is it was constructed as a cultural region long ago. And why, and how is that? And who did this? What were they reading onto it? What were the circumstances? And how did Daniel Boone in 40 years become hillbilly? that was really the question that I started to ask myself. Is you have these two stories from these two moments. Daniel Boone rolling with the great pioneers, Cumberland Gap, right? Exploring the kind of piercing the edge of the American empire with these peasants. And then 40 years later, they're toothless animals. They're stupid beasts, incapable of historical progress, dangerous and backward. What happened? And that was another one of my questions that had to do with the way that the region was defined. If what I'm giving you is just a kind of really intellectualized view of it, that is how I came to Appalachia. Of course, I knew about it as mining disasters and toxic destruction and entrenched poverty and racism and the working class voting for Donald Trump. And yeah, I knew all of that. And that was always hanging in the background at the same time. But it wasn't really my main question. It was like,
so when you were exploring and studying the region, can you explain to the audience, and you obviously explain it and you go in deep detail in your book, why is Appalachia so important to American history, and why is it so important to the US now?
Well, every region is important.
Yeah.
Every place is important. But there's a saying kind of in the way that historians look at regions and look at capitalism, which what happens on the periphery actually defines the center. So the old history was, well, the mountains doesn't really matter. Indigenous people, they don't really matter. They're just kind of a precursor. They're just an introduction to the real story, which has to do with the state formation and laws and the economy in places like Philadelphia and New York City. That is not how we look at it at all. In order to deal with these so-called peripheral places, the American state had to completely transform itself. It had to have a different kind of a military. It had to have a different kind of a language in order to deal with it. From the very beginning, constructing itself as this big territorial state was an obsession and a fear on the part of the Federalists as to whether or not it could even hold together, since there had not been a republic like that before, and they weren't convinced that it was going to survive. And sure enough, beginning with the Washington administration, there was all of these different projects and difficulties in formulating a military and a policy and an Indian policy and negotiating with the Creeks and negotiating with the Shawnee. And how are we going to deal with all of these different people that are now part of an American empire? How do we deal with them? So that it's important because it was one of the first places that was settled outside of the Old 13. It was literally over that proclamation line of 1763. It was right on the other side when the British said, no one is crossing this line. You are not going over there because you're gonna get mixed up with Indians and it's just gonna be trouble for us. They knew what they were talking about. They were trying to control the population and the politics and not wanting to careen out of control. But everybody, a lot of people, including George Washington, wanted to cross that line. And that line was the line on the top of the Appalachian Ridge, of the mountains, the geology. So it was the first frontier, if you want, outside of that Old 13. And that's why it was important then. But then in the 19th century, cool. It became the origin of the key central commodity of the entire industrial world, the fulcrum of all subsequent climate change, and of industrial capitalism itself, came from there. So it has plenty of importance.
Right. And one of the most interesting chapters, I found myself taking notes on every single page because I had no idea about the backstory, was the chapter about Hamilton and the Rye Rebellion. And it's infinitely fascinating how a smart man like Hamilton completely misunderstood the region. And what's your, can you explain how he misunderstood it and how his view of the world was actually detrimental to the region?
Yeah, well, maybe he did understand.
Hmm.
Maybe he did understand it. Maybe he didn't care. He understood how people, on frontiers and settlers, and he understood how they made their living. He wanted to change it. And I think that the way that I arrived at Hamilton's point of view, just using his own words, has to do with that crisis on the part of the founders of a big territorial republic, that we associate so much with Madison and like the Federalist Number 10 and Madison's own concern about how it can possibly be ruled. But it was actually Hamilton who said, every square inch of what is the United States has got to have the same authority of the Constitution in every single place. The old frontier was sort of, as you moved away from the castle, the authority of the Lord kind of dropped off on a gradient. So there was a certain point where you could be out in the woods, Robin Hood and your band of thieves, and essentially it wasn't clear who was responsible to try to track you down. There was no clear line of authority in those places. Hamilton said that cannot be the United States. The law has to proliferate through subordinate institutions so that it is present everywhere. Courthouses was one of the first places where this could happen. Military forts was another way of doing it. This was the federal government far away from the seat of the federal government. And that was his idea. But he had this other idea too, which was kind of part and parcel of the whole thing. The economy is not separate from the polity. He took that fusion, that compound term, political economy, more seriously than Adam Smith could have even imagined. And he's one of the greatest true political economists. And that is that Hamilton said, the economy and the United States politically are not separate. They have to function together. We can fuse people to the state through this one institution that in fact combines both economy and politics. Taxes. Taxes are money and they're politics and they're the state. We can fuse the two together using taxation. If I can make these peasants pay taxes, then I can fuse them to the state in all kinds of other ways as well. And that's what I think he was setting out to do. I don't think there's any other way of doing that, but as at least one historian, some have pointed out to me, I don't have a real direct proof of it. It's more of a circumstantial kind of argument, which is not to say that it's a weak argument. It's just to say that he didn't just come out and explain this, although in some ways, in some instances, he was kind of close to doing that.
Yeah, and one of the overarching themes, I don't know, maybe I just got that from the book, is the fact that this region continues to be misunderstood by even historians, but I think Americans at large. What was Hamilton's intention wrong? Should he have just left the region to its own devices and just not brought it into the government at large, or was he right in doing what he did?
That's a tough one. It's in certain drafts of this, certain people read it and thought that I was a kind of anti-tax, putting it in today's politics, that I believe that there should be no taxation and the state should just basically disappear or something like that. I don't believe that. I don't. But I also kind of bridle at the idea, well, which would you choose, the world of Hamilton and the world of Jefferson? Well, it's a false choice because I wouldn't choose either necessarily. It's not the only two possible choices that I have.
If you don't mind me interrupting you, so what would you choose?
Like I said, it's a tough question. We have a very different politics today than existed then. So if I call myself a democratic socialist, it doesn't fit into either of these categories as an example. It just doesn't. Neither of them were operating in a situation where there were large industrial populations or people who weren't farmers or planters. or a world without slavery. So it's just a whole different world. It's sort of like asking, looking between, say, the medieval economy of Britain or of France, and which would you choose? Well, I don't necessarily have a connection or think that either one of them would be the ideal. So that's the first thing. But I think that what's deeper in your question is, should he have just left them alone, as I say? And I think that the answer is yeah. When you look at it circumstantially and you understand why he taxed them, one of the things that I bring up in the chapter is he had other options for raising revenue for the United States if that was his actual project. So he could have taxed slave sales, which would have been hugely controversial, and I'm not saying easy politically. He could have taxed them, a penny or $1 or something. He could have taxed construction and building. He could have levied a tax on legal procedures and legal paper, and all of these would have been controversial. This was what led to the American Revolution. I'm not saying that any American was going to bear an internal tax. This was by itself explosive. But why did he tax people he knew could not pay the tax? They could not pay it because of their economy, because he was attacking that very economy. And that's really the point. If he wanted to levy taxes, he had other options rather than pick on these people. So yeah, I think that there should be agrarians, and there should be people who can live in such a way that they don't participate in the money economy. And if they don't make money, they shouldn't be taxed. And I can uphold that and say that I believe that today. Mm-hmm. So yeah, I think that they should not have been taxed, and he had other options for doing that. But Hamilton also understood that the federal government could print money. And in his time, when there was a Bank of the United States, it actually could have done that. And you know what really brought about the end of this kind of financial isolation? His own army being paid for being soldiers. When they got to southwestern Pennsylvania, they spent money and infused cash into the locality in a way that, like a development project, just distributing money. The army itself actually spread enormous sums of currency all over the region, which is ironic.
Yeah. So again, when reading your book, I just, I think in many ways history defines regions and defines a lot of things, but this region in particular just seems to be, for lack of a better word, historically screwed. It's just they've been screwed for 300, 400 years. Mm-hmm. So you go from, Alexander Hamilton kind of trying to bring them into the government at large, and then you transition into coal and everything that happens there. And then now it's one of the poorest regions in the country. I mean, not everywhere, but like for the most part. Does history define regions to that degree? So, and is there a way out for the region going forward?
Yeah. Well, I'm not going to dwell on Hamilton, but they did kind of win that battle. they won round one, in that they sent him packing and they didn't pay the tax in. But yeah, they were completely undone, and it really had to do with the fact that they were sitting on all of these things that were defined as natural resources by this nascent emerging capitalism. And they had all sorts of disadvantages in dealing with centralized companies and the United States, and going out and trying to find a way to extract this stuff from them. They had all kinds of disadvantages. You might say that they couldn't win this battle, and they were utterly impoverished by it, and et cetera, et cetera. And when I was writing it, I also just didn't want to leave it at that. I didn't want to leave it at the mine disaster of a couple of years ago, or the leak on the Elk River of that, chemical that smelled like licorice, or rivers that run black. I just didn't want to do that. There's someone here vacuuming. If there's a noise, you might.
Oh no, it's fine.
Oh, I didn't want to leave it at that. So that's when I thought, okay, so what, I am not the person to do this. First of all, I don't live in the region. There's a lot of really talented, really capable, smart, informed, imaginative people who are imagining a future for Appalachia. But I said that as a thought experiment, I would jot some things down and I put it into the form of a bill, of an act of Congress, the Commons Communities Act. What I wanted to do was ask this question: would it be possible for people who wanted to live in a way that was essentially an autonomous agrarian, a free peasant, and have land, hunt, fish, farm, garden, and do those things, even as they participated in the cash economy, created commodities, and sold them on their own terms, as people always have? So that's what I wondered, if this could not be encouraged by the United States itself. Because what I didn't want was, well, what Appalachia needs is a corporate savior. It needs all of these Amazon warehouses. It needs Apple and Microsoft to come in, and they need to make iPhones there. A corporate savior is what they need. That's not what I would never, ever come up with that. I don't want that. I don't think it's good for them. It only puts them into the very same position that they've been in already. Now, a lot of people there would disagree with me and say, no, we would love to have 10 Amazon warehouses and corporate headquarters here. That we would love that. I'm not going to second guess them, but that's not my solution. My solution is for them to, in some ways, do what they had always done before. But, there's small industry, there's small businesses that could be encouraged. People could have their own businesses. There are other possibilities of infusing it with money, having population come back, having a division of labor there again. There are other possibilities. Even tourism, which is also controversial because places that become tourist meccas often have to really give up an awful lot of themselves for that. There's not an easy answer, because what really put them into this position in the first place, you might say, was they didn't have a landscape that was amenable to industrial production, factory production, or industrial agriculture. Like you can't have a giant combine on those mountains and in those hollows. It just makes no sense. So capital did not flow there for all kinds of reasons. Mm-hmm. And that's one reason it became financially isolated until it was taken over. So I'm not saying that the solution is easy, but there's a lot of people thinking about it.
Yeah. Another kind of general theme that I noticed when reading your book is elites, whomever you decide to define as elites. At the time, you can argue it was Hamilton, or maybe misunderstood capitalism and what it is to have a successful economy, and what is progress. Obviously, what's progress in New York City might not be progress in West Virginia, So, can you? How do going forward? How do we define progress in a capitalistic society?
Well, capitalism itself is really closely associated with this notion of progress, which I don't believe exists. To say that there's no such thing as progress, to say that you can say in a relative sense, I'm working on this research paper and it's going well, I'm making progress, or I'm building a house, making progress because I put the roof on. I'm not talking about that kind of progress. I'm talking about a kind of large-scale notion of historical progress in which things somehow almost magically improve or get better, become more complex or more sophisticated. When we talk about that, what we often mean is it's either being caused by capitalism, or there's something mysterious about it. Maybe it's God, that there's something, there's a spirit of progress where somehow this is happening under its own steam. Maybe it has to do with human beings themselves and human nature that is unfolding and is creating this sense of progress. The problem is that as a historian, there's just no evidence of it. If the development of coal was progress, is a climate disaster progress? If medical technology is progress, is the fact that most people can't afford it or medical insurance or to be treated with these new inventions, is that progress? In other words, whatever you want to identify as progress will always have another aspect of people who either can't participate or an unintended consequence that we won't think about as progress.
So is progress just something that everyone can participate in? Is that how you define progress, or am I misunderstanding?
I define progress as an attendant idea of capitalism that is really meant to justify it and technology. The magic thing about capitalism, the amazing thing about it, is that it becomes a self-expanding system where everybody's incentive to invest in something and make a profit leads to more incentive to invest in something and make a profit. Since machinery makes labor more productive, then machinery magically explodes all over the place because suddenly there is this incentive in order to have machinery so that there's more and more machinery and technology because it makes labor, because it creates so much money, it creates so much profit. But if you stand back and you don't see the hand behind it, then it looks like it's just this self-expanding thing. You might say that by itself, capitalism causes all of this progress because all of this technology and money is proliferating all by itself through this magic system. But it hides all of the destruction. It hides all of the poverty. It hides all of the control. It hides the development of a powerful class behind it and their privilege. It hides racism and the differential way in which those privileges and benefits are handed out. It hides all of them. It hides all of its costs, and it puts them onto society. I'm sorry, we want to believe in this thing called progress, but historians don't walk around saying this or that is progress because they understand that whatever we call that is itself part of the story and not separate from it, and not a kind of a independently operating spirit or series of forces. It's not.
But can people just
go ahead?
Sorry, but can people just come around and say, well, yes, I agree with you. There are sometimes intended and sometimes unintended consequences with capitalism, but if something really bad happens, like what you describe in the book with the coal mines, that's not capitalism. That's dirty capitalism. Like people, that's not how it's supposed to be done, which I think I would agree with. I'm sure you would agree with, but in some ways you can see direct progress with capitalism, because if you see, I don't know, let's talk about Amazon, like the most obvious example. It starts as, just another website, as an e-commerce website selling books. And now all of a sudden you go down the street and you can get anything you want. I'm not plugging Amazon, but you can get pretty much anything you want in a day or two, which is a miracle relative, like even 10 years ago, that's almost impossible. So in some ways, can you define that as progress?
I'm very glad to talk to you, Stanley. It's very good to do this because I don't often I'm often not able to have such a nice reasoned disagreement with somebody, but I'm not going to agree with you, and it's not going to come out exactly as you've expressed it. I understand what you mean by progress, and I do understand why you want to define a certain kind of capitalism as dirty capitalism,
crony capitalism. That's the word I was looking for.
And to take something like Amazon and to praise it for the efficiency and the convenience, but I don't see a distinction. And what happened in Appalachia and the way that the corporations behaved there was not an aberration of industrial capitalism. They behaved in exactly the way that industrial capitalism was always defined to behave. They took advantage.
Sorry. But wouldn't historically we've also had corrections, right? So if companies got too big, we try to break them up. I think that's a conversation going on now with tech companies and all that. So can't you argue that there's people can acknowledge the fact that there are serious deficiencies in capitalism without saying that a lot of capitalistic qualities has brought progress. Sorry, I'm going to keep using that word, but progress. Yeah, I understand. You can now go and say, well, yeah, Stanley, you're right. Amazon, you can get something in 2 days or 1 day. That's great. That you could define that as progress. But look at the back end. They're not treating their employees very well. Et cetera, et cetera. And that's fair point.
Look at all of the fumes and carbon dioxide from the delivery truck. Look at the massive amount of consumption in landfills, plastics and petroleum that go into all the crap that we consume, that they facilitate as this kind of middleman. It's not as simple as simply convenience. All of these externalities, which is what economists call them, we're talking about carbon dioxide and junk and landfills. The fact that this is not internalized into their business model is perfectly obvious, because if it was, there's no way they could do business. So the fact that these things are constantly dumped out into the public is essential to Amazon's success. It cannot compensate for those things, or it would cease to exist. So you can't look at it just in the service that it provides, but you have to be able to look at all of the other attendant things that actually make that service possible. But I wanted to say something else about antitrust legislation and the fact that there are safety procedures in coal mines today, and there is an 8-hour day, and there are 2-week vacations, and there's a Clean Air Act and a Clean Water Act. These things don't have to do with capitalism. They all come about in direct resistance and opposition to it. So if you want to embrace those things, that's fine. I do too. I think that they're great. But you have to understand that capitalists fought. Every single one of them said that they were going to destroy capitalism, that they were anti-American. And I'm talking about environmentalism and all the acts of the 1970s. That the 8-hour day, the weekend, unemployment compensation, all of this came about because of the labor movement, because of strikes that coal companies met with bats and guns and even bombs. In other words, there was huge, massive, violent resistance to all of these things. Now you want to say, well, we have these things and it makes capitalism better. That's fine, but you should understand where they came from, which was in complete opposition to what the capitalists themselves wanted. And not because they themselves thought it was a good idea. They never did. So there's a historian or a theorist historian from the 1930s named Karl Polanyi. He wrote a book called The Great Transformation. And it's really about how World War II came about, emerging from the late 19th century and the economic world. It's a brilliant book. It's often quoted. But one of the things he talks about, he has this idea called the double movement. He says that the people in charge of capitalism, they couldn't do everything they wanted because it always provoked a response, always. And these were always, to use a Marxian term, they were always in dialectical conflict with each other. It wasn't one or the other that ever existed. They're always fighting it out. And so that's kind of what you're saying, maybe.
Are you arguing, so would you argue that there's a better way to go going forward? Maybe we should, maybe capitalism, whatever people define capitalism as, is not, the way forward, maybe something better exists?
Oh yeah, there's definitely something better that exists.
Have we
Sure.
found have we found it?
Well, everyone is always demanding something like a redistribution from a socialist policy as something that's not field tested. It's like, well, where's the evidence? Well, where's your example? Well, what I say about that is capitalism was never field tested. Nobody ever studied it. Nobody produced a report, right? It came about as a massive ongoing experiment that kind of gained adherence and was rationalized usually after it was already implemented. So I'm in favor of really big and bold experiments in redistributing money and profits, and having workers and members of society own industries together. And I think the real problem is capital itself. The thing is that it's always looking for a new source of nature and a new source of labor in order to get in there and exploit it and turn it to its advantage. But what's happened in just the last 50 years is a massive ecological and social crisis, all brought to us by capital. Every single ecological system is in free fall. Every single environment, almost every single species is basically in complete free fall, from things that are proximate, toxic waste dumps, the destruction of habitat, or more generalized climate change, a global temperature that's over 1 degree from its pre-industrial level. And the way that it's affected society is also something that we're just trying to wrap our minds around, and how it's warped politics and created centers of power that are anti-democratic and feed into all sorts of terrible impulses on the part of people. So I may not be able to stand here and to outline for you exactly what a socialist society looks like, though there are people who have done that. What I want to present to you is that there is plenty of reason for a rational person to say, we ought to try something else right now. That it doesn't mean the end of freedom. It doesn't mean the end of money. It doesn't mean the end of a division of labor or buying things that we need. It actually could mean greater community. And you know what I want? I want a world in which people don't exploit each other or exploit environments. You cannot rip the guts out of an ecosystem for profit, and you can't take advantage of other people and hurt them for profit either. I don't know what you call that.
Right. I think that the problem is definitions, right? So people always, not that they want tried and true ways of having a successful society, right? You don't have to run tests of a certain like a safety net program or whatever. It's when people, it doesn't have to mean the end of freedom or liberties or whatnot.
Good.
Yeah, no, that I agree. That's the world I want to live in too. But unfortunately, maybe that's also human nature. Every time this experiment historically has been run, I mean, you can look at the 20th century. My parents are from the Soviet Union. That experiment was run, in Maoist China, that experiment was run.
Yeah.
Again, I'm not.
Yeah.
Obviously, people are always going to say, well, that's not what I want. Obviously, that's not what people want. You don't want 50 million people getting murdered over the course of, a few.
No, I don't. And people on the left this has been a long-standing problem. China and the Soviet Union, they screwed everything up. They did it all wrong. They were just a bunch of idiots and psychopaths. And so, yeah, I have nothing good to say about either of those things. You're not going to get me to do that at all. But there's a saying that William F. Buckley was very fond of. Mm-hmm. He would say, well, the problem with socialism is socialism. The problem with capitalism is capitalists. Meaning that in one sense, the system itself is kind of self-corrupting. It's always going to destroy itself and destroy society. But for capitalism, we have bad apples. we have people who are making certain decisions, and we can have different people and different possible decisions, and the system itself basically can't be saved. That's just kind of on the surface of it is absurd. So I guess that I would turn it around. I could turn it around, what William of Buckley, and say that the problem of both has to do with the way that they're cast and the way that they're initiated. And it's not human nature, of which is not something that is easily defined or reducible to any certain kind of historical form. The rise of Stalin is not proof that there is a human nature which in a socialist society is bound to commit mass murder. So you could turn it around and say, well, then there can be a humane capitalism as well. And it is possible for there to be a capitalism that accepts a far lower rate of profit, that would place at the forefront human survival and community survival, and that would have a zero growth ecological policy where it could not take from environments and just trash the world. If capitalism could exist within humane and ecological boundaries and survive, it would be a capitalism I could live with. I'm not sure that that can happen. Whereas my definition of socialism is in fact that it has to be both, it has to preserve both humanity and nature at the same time. It has to do that, which is not Chinese or Russian socialism, by the way. It's neither of them.
Yeah,
So,
and I think, as I mentioned before, I think the issue is definitions, right? So I can tell you what my vision for capitalism is, and you can tell me what, you know, your vision for a better, just society is, maybe incorporating more socialist policies or whatnot. I think the issue is, we're both gonna, but I think both sides of the aisle talk about it in very, very like surface level terms. People on the, I guess, the far left, you would say, they would say something like, well, you know, those Stalin guys and Hitler, not Stalin, not Hitler, sorry, Stalin and Mao, yeah, that's not what we want, right? And they try very hard to detach themselves from that, but they can't. Then on the other side is people saying, well, capitalism is good. Well, that's great, but you gotta elaborate, and at a point you gotta stop beating your own chest and saying, well, why is it good? What? And look, I'm one of those guys. Maybe this is a respectful disagreement I'm going to have with you, but I'm one of those guys that will defend capitalism. Obviously, there are. I mean, I got one of my majors in college was economics, so it is. There are externalities, there are trade-offs, and I remember, I forgot, I think it was Nassim Nicholas Taleb in one of his books. He wrote a really good line. I think everyone is a socialist in their homes, and then like the further up you go, so the bigger, you know, society. I think once you get up to government level, it's better to leave it to locales to deal with however they want to live society. So people are libertarian, it should be libertarians up here and socialists in their own homes, and that kind of makes sense to me. But but sorry, we kind of deviated a little bit from your book, and I do have a few more questions. What really left an impression, what from your book, is actually the last line, and I haven't done this yet, but the one of the last lines you have, if you don't mind, can I just read it, because it was the question we need to ask of everyone, of every migration from country to city, is whether it originated from a government scheme or corporate gambit that so degraded a people's autonomy as to give them no choice. We need to know history in order to make policy. Otherwise, we might allow an old story to think for us, a story told for centuries that has never told the truth. I read that and I closed the book and I was like, you know what? That's I think every history book should finish that way, because if we don't know our history, we're bound to repeat past mistakes. And what struck me is there are a lot of people like you mentioned that fight for Appalachian, and I think J.D. Vance, who blurbed your book, but his book Hillbilly Elegy that became a movie now, uh, sort of put Appalachian on the map or back on the map because we kind of ignored the region for way too long. I think there are regions we started to focus on a little more. And do you know of any particular um, initiatives that are currently ongoing to that, if people wanted to help, how can they help the region? What can they do going forward to, kind of get them out of this historic rut?
Let's see. Like I said, there's a lot of organizations. I mean, I could like look them up. There are organizations dedicated to the environment and water quality, to labor, and there are people who are rethinking the future of Appalachia. By the way, again, some are looking for a corporate savior and some are not. So you have this large range. But I think a major problem is that the politics of the region in basically all of the states have a very strongly Republican bent to them, which, and I'm not just trying to trash Republicans, but in this form right now, what I'm saying is they're looking for very standard old ways of economic development. They don't want to give up on coal. They want to find ways to make coal viable and to pull more coal out when coal is in fact dying under its own weight. It's failing in its competition with solar and wind power, as an example. The coal mines themselves are closing because they're not profitable. But they can't stop thinking about coal as the future of Appalachia. And there's a lot of these states have Republicans who are in power. And so what I'm saying is that they have no ideas. Is they're really not thinking imaginatively, whereas the people who are lack power right now. So that's a huge problem. And that is that from the very top levels of all of these states, I'm thinking of the congressional delegation of West Virginia, including Joe Manchin, who is a Democrat. I just don't see imaginative thinking going on among any of them. You would think that they simply want to trap the entire region in poverty. They're so silent on actual new ideas for what to do. You would think that they simply accept it. As far as Vance goes, he definitely drew attention to the region, but his book has no history in it. No history at all. There's no sense of where his family's poverty in a longer train of thought, in a longer legacy, where it came from. He just wants to blame that poverty on the very people who are those who are suffering it, saying that it's a failure in their character. Nobody needs that crap. Failure in their character. He wants to say they don't work hard enough. They work harder than anybody. Nobody works harder than the working poor. Nobody works so hard. I don't know what he's talking about. I don't. And I'm not the only one. I mean, that book actually has spawned an entire response book from people in Appalachia. Not just essays, but poetry and fiction. And there's kind of an outpouring of anger and passion about the region that he did set off. But all of it is a way of saying, are we really even talking about the same place? Do you know anything about it? You who come from Ohio and basically spent your summers and times in Kentucky. So he's not loved in the region kind of universally. And I wonder if he himself would backtrack from anything that he wrote in that book too, if given the chance. I wonder. But
Yeah, I did read some of the criticisms of his book. I personally, I like the book. I think it was well written and it was interesting.
Can I just say that as a memoir, I have no problem with it.
Right.
How can you not admire his accomplishment and getting out of that family and going to school and ending up at Yale Law School? Anyone would admire it. But he moves beyond that and he wants to use it for social commentary. And that's where people are angry, not about his own story, because that's unassailable.
I think what I noticed in his book, maybe um, the people that criticized his book obviously had a different opinion than I did, but it, I didn't see it generally as him criticizing people, meaning criticizing the fact that they were lazy or bums. He was What he was trying to say is, yes, obviously, because he wrote a memoir, he didn't write a history of Appalachia like you did. Um, he couldn't probably go into the history, nor did he want to. I think at a point, people can know their history, can be deeply affected by their history. But I think what I noticed in his book is that, you know, we have to get ourselves out of this rut. There's no white knight. There's nobody coming in to help us, whether it be government or
Right.
the Amazons or whatever. So we got to get again, I'm sorry, I don't do this usually on the podcast, but we got
Go
to get
ahead.
our shit together, right? Like,
Yeah,
and
yeah,
and
yeah.
look, I've never been. I definitely want to go to the region and
Sure.
obviously see for myself. But I think that's an observation maybe he noticed, and maybe that worked for him because with him, his mom was a drug addict, and then his grandma, who was in many ways crazy, but also the definition of a very good grandma,
Oh,
kind
she
of.
saved his life. Yeah.
Yeah, she put him on
Creative
a course
stability.
to succeed.
Absolutely. Yeah.
So I think he goes, look, if everyone has some kind of guidance, a little bit, a guiding light, um, you can make something of your life. This is not forever. This region doesn't have to be stuck in this perpetual poverty for the next 100 years, just because it's been for the last 300 years.
That's true. But what you're basically explaining the kind of trap, the idea that, are we trapped or determined by a previous history? To what extent are we free individuals who can transcend those events? It's complicated. I mean, you told me that your parents came from the Soviet Union and they have a particular understanding or notion of socialism that has shaped the way that they look at the world. I'm not saying that can't change or become more nuanced, etc., but they have a certain experience that helped to shape them. And this entire region, the way that all of these events coalesce and come together, is to create basically cycles of poverty and desperation and pain that haven't gone away, that are reproduced, that do affect how children are born and what they're brought up in, and they're not easily transcended. He had a grandmother who created the stability. Other people could have that grandmother, but you can't have a public policy that stipulates having a grandmother who creates a place for you to study. And
Well, yes, I agree with you. I didn't mean to interrupt, but um, I agree. But for example, I remember Barack Obama had a policy. It wasn't a policy. It was kind of a my brother's keeper, right? It was called My Brother's Keeper, and I think it was in Chicago. And in many ways, they tried to create mentors for people that were, you know, well, maybe didn't have them. And some people would argue that works, right? I mean, the president of the United States thought it works,
yeah,
and maybe that's something that J.D. Vance would be in support of. I don't know. I have never spoken to J.D. Vance, but so something like that. Obviously, he's not. Nobody can replicate Mama into every household in Appalachia,
right.
but you can have guiding lights. And it seems to me that every time I read a book about people that came from that region, that were raised in poverty, and they kind of made it out. I think Tara Westover had a novel, Educated. It was pretty popular a few years ago. Another one kind of made it out of this religious cult. I'm not saying that that's the region at large, but um, she 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 would cling to somebody that she knew that went to college or whatever, and that was her guiding light. And I think we can't underestimate the power of that. We can't underestimate the power of
No,
role models. And the government can't create role models, but there are people that are very successful that came from the region. And unfortunately, they don't go back very often.
There are. One question that hangs behind the book, though, is whether or not there is a public. I agree with you. A guy, a mentoring program, I would never disagree with that. But behind the book is the idea that there is no public policy that's going to save Appalachia. He almost verbatim says that there is no public policy that's going to save us. Well, if there is no public policy that's going to save you, then all you're relying on is people just picking themselves up by their bootstraps, which is exactly the problem. His mother couldn't do that. So he basically walks away and says that there really is no solution. I want to say something about the memoir part two. One of the ways that the book opens is he has a job working in a warehouse, like floor tiling or something. And there's a couple that works there, and they just it's a good job, and they just don't show up. They have trouble showing up, or it's sporadic, and they finally get fired, and they lose this good job. And he goes on and on about how irresponsible they are and how they kind of come to represent the very kind of recklessness, irresponsibility that he associates with his own people in Appalachia. But what really bothers me about that story is he doesn't know anything about them. He doesn't know why they don't show up for work. He doesn't know what's going on in their lives. He doesn't know if there's a substance abuse problem, which he might judge very harshly, or if there is something else going on that would prevent them or whatever. People don't want to be self-destructive. They don't want to hurt themselves, and they don't want to undo themselves in this world. They don't. So if they do, we can either be judgmental, or we can ask, what is it that is preventing you from living the fullest possible life? These are two very different ways of looking at social change and people suffering. And in fact, history, is we can try to understand why people behave that way under the assumption that we all need there's only one human nature. We all need the same things. We need love and community. We need to live in a place that's safe. We need enough food to eat. Human nature has to do with these needs, and not perverse incentives or the invisible hand or whether or not I'm selfish, or this is not human nature. These things are conditioned by society. But our most basic needs, what Marx called species being, these are the things that we actually share altogether with everybody. And they're the things that social systems can either reinforce and enhance or undermine and destroy. And I think Vance is a good example of confusing them.
This is a great conversation, but to wrap up the conversation in the interest of time, I finish off the conversation with two questions. Answer them in any order you wish. The first one is, what gives you hope for the future, if you have any hope? I've had a person in the past who did not have any hope, but and the second is, what are 5 books on any topic just that you would recommend to anyone?
Oh, gosh, they're probably sitting on my desk. Okay, I can do that. Can I do the books first?
Yeah, go for it.
I would have Marshall Berman's All That Is Solid Melts Into Air, about a brilliant literary history of modernity. I would recommend Footprints by David Ferry, a book about what he calls future fossils, about the things that we're going to leave behind for future generations. I am reading The Progress of This Storm, Nature and Society in a Warming World by Andreas Malm, which is a completely brilliant and unbelievable book in understanding the theoretical distinctions between nature and society. Herman Melville's Moby Dick, I find indispensable, and I return to it. A Farewell to Arms by Ernest Hemingway is indispensable as a guide for writing, and I return to it. Verling Klinkenborg's book, Several Short Sentences on Writing, is the greatest book about writing that I've ever read. I guess I'll end there. Is that 5?
I think that's 6.
And I would throw in The Wealth of Nations and the first volume of Marx's Capital. Everyone should read both of those.
I actually liked, I always forget what it's called, but Adam Smith had a book before Wealth of Nations. And I always feel like that's not taught in universities very often, but I have to read it in college. Oh,
Theory of Moral Sentiment. The
there we
Theory of
go.
Moral Sentiments. Yeah.
That's a great book. I enjoyed that a whole lot.
And the connections between them. It is very interesting, something that I've thought about. Yeah.
Yeah.
Well, what gives me hope? Yeah, is just people fighting. Is I can become quite despairing. Something that Bill McKibben and others have said is, it doesn't really matter how bad things get, I'm not going to stop. There's no point at which I'm going to say, oh, it's over, I give up. What gives me hope is seeing other people who say that in the midst of despair, they're not going to stop and they're going to keep going. In raising family, in our everyday, not your heroic things, but our everyday things. In raising your family and loving your children, in joining political movements and voting, and in never stopping trying to repair the world. Yeah.
Awesome.
Kunulam,
Yeah.
that it may seem trite, but it keeps me going.
Stephen Stoll, it was a pleasure. Thank you for coming on.
Stanley Goldberg. Thank you. Okay.